President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky listed 20 points in the peace plan discussed by Ukraine, the United States and Russia. According to him, this is a basic document about ending the war. And let me remind you, this is the document that was discussed for 3 days in Miami by the American delegation, together with the Ukrainian one, then with the Russian delegation, and again with the Ukrainian one. In other words, this is the finalized document that should form the basis of the peace settlement. This is the final version. Well, there you go. The Russians have already stated today that they will demand their own amendments to this document, although in fact this document was discussed with Kirill Dmitriev in Miami with Stephen Witkoff. Let's find out what's in this peace plan. It's our first time seeing it publicly. What are all 20 points and how are they outlined? Of course, there are hidden parts that are included as separate attachments to this peace plan, but we will discuss what is already publicly known and we will definitely analyze each of the points. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, and please write any detailed comment under this video, because it really helps promote the content on YouTube. By the way, you can wish each other a Merry Christmas, and also subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pichi News. The link is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as soon as it comes in. So, the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, during a conversation with journalists on December 24, mentioned 20 points of a peace plan that Ukraine, the United States and Russia have been discussing in recent weeks. Let me remind you, there were originally 28 points, but many of the crazy demands from the Russians were simply thrown out of the document. And so, according to Zelensky, Kyiv is waiting for a response from the Russian side regarding the points being discussed. After that, quote, "We will understand our next steps and the possible timeframes for certain decisions," end quote. If we are talking specifically about these 20 points that exist today, this is a framework document that has undergone significant evolution. This is the document that previously started with 28 points, and as a result, today we have this document which looks like this. It's a draft. This is not yet a document agreed upon by the parties, but it already has a certain logic formed in it, suggesting how to end this war. It's important to note right away that today the Russians have essentially rejected this peace plan and said they intend to seek changes to the draft peace plan, including, for example, tightening restrictions on the armed forces of Ukraine and demanding official status for the Russian language in Ukraine. They are interested in what will happen next with the sanctions, the frozen Russian assets. The Kremlin is demanding the entire Donetsk region, and so on and so forth. I had a separate episode about this, and the logic behind the Kremlin's behavior is described in the previous episode on this YouTube channel. So, if you haven't watched it, go back and be sure to check it out. Now let's move on to that very peace plan. So, what did Volodymyr Zelensky show us? And what is outlined in these 20 points? The first point is the confirmation of Ukraine's sovereignty. Interestingly, this is essentially a reconfirmation because Ukraine is already sovereign. It's written in the constitution. And it turns out that we kind of have to hear once again from our partners and most importantly from our enemies that our country is recognized as sovereign. The second point provides for an unconditional non-aggression agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and a monitoring mechanism will be established along the line of contact. Interesting that Ukraine wants Russia to legally adopt a non-aggression clause toward Ukraine and Europe, and in the third point, Ukraine will get strong security guarantees. We'll discuss this separately later. Fourth, Ukraine's armed forces will number 800,000 during peacetime. Right now, for example, in my Telegram channel, one of the subscribers asked a question, saying there's an inconsistency here. Why exactly 800,000? After all, right now there are 1,100,000 soldiers in the armed forces of Ukraine, and so on. I'll explain the logic as I see it. First, 1,100,000. These include the armed forces, National Guard, security service, police, and other Ukrainian defense units, not just the armed forces, but all supporting groups. Accordingly, we understand that most of it goes specifically to these formations. Plus, it's important to understand that there's a time caveat here. That is, this applies in peacetime. 800,000 is exactly the core that's enough to fully cover the entire front line. The entire full-scale war has shown that within these limits, we have enough soldiers to cover the whole front line, and this is peacetime. That is, as soon as it's wartime, there is immediate mobilization, additional drafts, and so on, and our army increases. The fifth point, the United States, NATO, and Europe will provide Ukraine with security guarantees similar to Article 5. If Russia invades Ukraine, there will be a military response and sanctions will be reinstated. If Ukraine invades Russia or opens fire on Russian territory without provocation, the security guarantees will be revoked. If Russia opens fire on Ukraine, the security guarantees must immediately come into effect. An interesting point emerged here. According to Zelensky, this point also mentioned compensation for the United States of America for the security guarantees, but now this point has been crossed out. So they actually told Donald Trump, if anything, give us some money. For the fact that we guarantee your security, you shouldn't just be grateful to us, you should also compensate us for it. These are allies, a partner who says, we'll guarantee your security, but you must pay. Let me quote further. Bilateral security guarantees are not out of the question. According to this agreement, as Zelensky stated, it's about the possibilities of our bilateral agreements with 30 countries. We want to keep such opportunities. These are the coalition of the willing, 30 countries including Europe, Canada and Japan that are ready in one way or another to stand with us in ensuring security. The sixth point is that Russia will enshrine a policy of non-aggression towards Europe and Ukraine in all necessary laws and documents, including ratification in the State Duma. Ukraine will become a member of the European Union at a certain time and will receive short-term privileged access to the European market. European Union membership for Ukraine is part of the security guarantees. Kyiv wants to set a specific date for joining. That is, the peace plan should specify exactly when we must join. The eighth point is a solid global development package for Ukraine, which will be defined in a separate investment agreement. It will include in particular a development fund for investment, the development of gas infrastructure, the restoration of territory, and the extraction of minerals and natural resources. Here's an interesting point. At this stage, it's still unclear whether the Americans will recognize Russian control over the occupied territories or not. The ninth point is that several funds will be created to address issues related to the restoration of the Ukrainian economy, the reconstruction of damaged areas and regions, and humanitarian issues. The goal is to attract $800 billion. After signing this agreement, which is the 10th point, Ukraine will accelerate the process of concluding free trade agreements with the United States. Washington wants to sign a free trade agreement with both Ukraine and Russia. The 11th point. Ukraine confirms that it will remain a non-nuclear state according to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. The 12th point. This is interesting. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. According to President Zelensky, no compromise has been reached on this issue. Washington's proposal is that the plant will be operated jointly by Ukraine, the United States, and Russia. The United States proposes to divide control equally. At the same time, the Americans will be the main manager of this joint venture. The Ukrainian proposal is different. The Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant will be a joint venture that includes the United States and Ukraine. 50-50, no unwashed Russians. There can't be any Ukrainians in the management of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. In this case, Ukraine gets 50% of the electricity produced, and the other 50% can be distributed by the United States however they want. If they want, they can sell it to Russians. If not, they can do whatever they want with it. But Ukraine's position is that the seizure of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant by Russians cannot be legalized. It looks very strange, and it would just set a precedent for the whole world. Unwashed invaders come, seize a nuclear, let me emphasize, a nuclear power plant, and then our allies tell us, well, listen, just split it 50-50. It's like I come to you, take your money, I don't know, your $100. Then someone offers to mediate, saying, just give him $50 and you'll both have 50. Problem solved. That's obviously not the answer. Sorry for explaining this simply, but it seems odd that Russia would have any right to control the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Let's move on. Point 13. Ukraine and Russia commit to implementing educational programs in schools and throughout society that promote understanding and tolerance of different cultures and eliminate racism and prejudice. Ukraine will introduce European Union rules on religious tolerance and protection of minority languages. Here's an interesting point. We need to discuss it. Okay. So basically, Ukraine is saying that we support respecting the Russian language, for example, in Ukraine, but then Russia is also obliged to implement educational programs in schools. To explain that Ukraine is a sovereign state, there are no Nazis or Banderites there. To explain to their unwashed Russians that this is a separate nation, it's not some kind of brotherly people, it's not one people, no, it's a separate neighboring nation. To explain Ukraine's history to Russians so future generations understand what's happening. So, if that's how it's going to be built, if Ukrainian schools, Ukrainian newspapers, Ukrainian news websites appear in Russia, okay, then we can talk about the possibility of discussing tolerance towards the Russian language in Ukraine. For example, Putin recently stated that there are between 5 and 10 million Ukrainians living in Russia. Okay, let's provide education in Ukrainian for those 10 million Ukrainians. If you're sure there are that many in Russia, introduce education in Ukrainian, do something. I highly doubt the Kremlin would go for that. The 14th point, the territory issue, is actually the most difficult point. According to Zelensky, it was assumed that in the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia and Kherson regions, the location of the troops on the date of the peace agreement would be considered the de facto recognized line of contact. Russia must withdraw its troops from the Dnipropetrovsk, Mykolaiv, Sumy and Kharkiv regions for this agreement to come into force. Zelensky said Moscow wants Ukraine to leave the Donetsk region. The United States is offering a compromise, a free economic zone, meaning it would belong to neither side. If there is no agreement to stay where we are, meaning no one withdraws anywhere, then the free economic zone can only be accepted through a referendum among Ukrainians. At the same time, Zelensky noted that the United States supports a referendum, but the entire document should be put to a vote, not just a single question. A referendum requires at least 60 days, so there needs to be a real ceasefire in Ukraine for 60 days. So there's an interesting point here. It's unclear, so before signing the agreement, there needs to be a 60-day ceasefire, meaning the Russians have to agree to this temporarily, and after 60 days a referendum is held in Ukraine. Ukrainians decide whether we agree to a free economic zone in Donbass or not. Only then is a peace agreement made. Point 15. After agreeing on future territorial arrangements, Russia and Ukraine undertake not to change these arrangements by force. Point 16. Russia will not prevent Ukraine from using the Dnipro River and the Black Sea for commercial activities. Well, it means that Ukrainian vessels will pass along the Dnipro through the occupied territories. A separate maritime agreement and an access agreement will be concluded, which will cover the freedom of navigation and transportation. Within the framework of this agreement, Kinburn Spit will be point 17. To resolve outstanding issues, a humanitarian committee will be established, exchange of prisoners of war, all for all, return of civilians, including children and political prisoners, and addressing the problems of conflict victims. Point 18. Ukraine must hold elections as soon as possible after signing the agreement, first presidential, then parliamentary. Point 19. This agreement will be legally binding, and its implementation will be monitored by the Peace Council chaired by Donald Trump. Violations will be subject to sanctions, but which ones are not yet known. Point 20. Once all parties agree to this agreement, a complete ceasefire will immediately take effect. 21. Ukraine will submit the agreement for ratification by the Ukrainian parliament or hold a nationwide referendum for its approval. Ukraine may decide to hold elections simultaneously with the referendum. It is assumed that the agreement will enter into force after both parties fulfill their obligations under this agreement. Security guarantees will only take effect if the agreement is fully ratified or approved by a referendum. Zelensky said that besides the peace plan, 3 other documents are being discussed. This includes a trilateral document between Ukraine, the United States, and Europe on security guarantees, a bilateral document between Ukraine and the United States on security guarantees, and a roadmap for the recovery and economic development of Ukraine until 2040. The Kremlin, as you know, today said that no, we don't like any of the 20 points, and we will sort of review and revise them. And I explained exactly what the Kremlin wants to revise in the previous episode. So be sure to go to the channel and watch it if you haven't seen it yet. So, when I published these 20 points of the peace plan today on my Telegram channel Pechi News, one of the subscribers actually asked an interesting question. What if Russia opens fire under a foreign flag or through some unknown individuals? Well, I guess they mean so-called little green men. like it was in Crimea. So does that mean the security guarantees just stop working then? Well, because the agreement states that if Russia opens fire on Ukraine, then the Americans and Europeans must somehow respond to this, including by military means. There is an answer to this. Because during the negotiations that took place in Miami last weekend, the issue was discussed that American intelligence agencies would have to constantly monitor and track all actions and movements of the Russian army. And there was a specific clause stating that the American intelligence must monitor to make sure that, God forbid, there isn't an attack under a false flag. If such a false flag attack happens, then it will be the task of American intelligence to identify that it was the Russians, and the security guarantees will still remain in effect. So these points were precisely discussed in detail at the negotiations that took place in Miami last weekend. Therefore, as far as I understand, the Ukrainian military, along with Umarov, were the ones who were working out these subtle points during the negotiations. Remember, we're only discussing the public part. There's also a non-public part, like security guarantees, to keep in mind. There will be several documents. I already made a video about this on YouTube, but I'll repeat. There's one public political document, and there's a technical document, and here's the technical document. This is the part of the agreement that concerns exclusively the military, exclusively the mechanics of actions, what to do, and that's exactly where it's specified. What if? Here are several points. What if foreign flags are involved, unknown individuals appear, and so on. Again, it's clearly stated there what is considered a violation of the ceasefire, one shot, or I don't know, a howitzer shot, or what exactly should be identified as a violation of the ceasefire. That's why all these technical details are clearly outlined there, so I wouldn't worry about that. And there's one more point that my followers have pointed out. They wrote that it's supposedly a weak and dangerous structure. Tying long-term guarantees to a single political figure, Donald Trump, here I need to clarify one thing. No one is planning to tie security guarantees and a peace agreement to the person of Donald Trump. That's exactly why Ukraine is demanding the ratification of security guarantees in the United States Congress, in both chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. If the document is ratified, it becomes legally binding. This document is not one signed by just any president. It's a document signed between the states of Ukraine and the United States of America. Therefore, when you hear that ratification is happening in Parliament, this ratification is essentially the will of the American people to provide security guarantees for Ukraine. Do you understand this document isn't connected to Donald Trump in any way? If in a few years a Democrat or Republican takes power in America and says no more guarantees, what then? Then, in order to repeal this law, they would have to go through Congress again, and only Congress would be able to repeal it or not repeal it. Also, remember, every agreement always includes safeguards, protections against such actions, and it always states that, for example, one of the parties can terminate the current agreement but must give notice beforehand. For example, NATO operates under a system where any member of the North Atlantic Alliance can leave, but they must notify all allies at least a year in advance that they intend to withdraw. That's not the case here. These are all subtle legal points that are specifically outlined, and Ukraine insists on them. For now, it's important to know this isn't a final peace plan. Of course, it has a lot of flaws, maybe some inconsistencies, and maybe there are things that seem unclear or strange to us. But Zelensky, by the way, admitted that not everything has been fully agreed upon yet, and we can see that the Russians are already refusing. They say that they will argue, they will challenge it, they will offer their own options, and so on. That's why I think negotiations will take a while. Subtitles by Dimatorzok. I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinion and conclusions in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. Friends, if you found this episode interesting and the information useful, you can support the work of this YouTube channel with your donation using the links and details in the description of this video. It says there, support the channel Alexei Pechi. Choose any format that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support from you. Once again, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year holidays to everyone. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.